Glendora Historical Society for hosting me and my lecture on the select depots of the San Fernando Valley and the San Gabriel Valley. When I was getting ready for this lecture, I was doing a little bit of, well, actually a lot of research on the various depots that were located throughout the San Gabriel and adjacent valleys. Railroad development in Southern California, especially around Los Angeles, produced a vast amount of different railroad stations over the years, beginning in the 1870s and even up until the present day. So I broke my lecture into two parts for our presentation this evening. The first part will be about the depots of the San Fernando Valley, and then we will delve into some of the beautiful depots that were present in the San Gabriel Valley. To give you a little background about myself, again, I am an architectural historian and draftsman. I work for an architect up in Santa Barbara, California. And I have been working in the architectural field for 20 years. And just, but my passion has always been architectural history. I've been researching depots since 1983. I grew up in Indio, California, down in the Southern California desert near Palm Springs. And I fell in love with the two-story train station that was in my hometown. So like I said, I'm an architectural draftsman. My passion is drawing blueprints of historic railroad stations and also historic buildings. This was a book that I produced in 2017, and it's a collection of 48 of my blueprints of various railroad stations and historic buildings. Since that time, I've drawn closer to about 120 different blueprints. These blueprints serve to educate the community about their historic depots. They document the depots that still exist, or they aim to recreate depots that we've lost over time. I've partnered with many communities on the historic preservation of their depots, documentation of depots, writing depot histories. And of course, my favorite passion is visiting the depots in person. And yes, including even the one in Disneyland. Big Disneyland Railroad fan. In 2017, I was awarded the Leicester B Holland Prize from the National Park Service and Library of Congress. And believe it or not, it wasn't for a railroad depot. It was actually for a historic barn in Santa Paula, California. But still, it was a great building to draw and study. And it just shows my passion for architectural history. Well, let's take a journey back about 130, 40 years ago, actually longer, and take a look at some of the railroad depots that you would find in the San Fernando Valley and in Southern California. This first part of the lecture will focus primarily on Southern Pacific depots because those were the predominant depots that were found in the San Fernando Valley. This is one of the earliest ones. This is the San Fernando Board and Batten Depot, built in 1874. When railroads were first building their depots, they were very simple utilitarian structures. They were serving the agricultural regions of Southern California. Passenger service was actually not the primary revenue generating factor for the railroads. It was actually the agricultural products and stuff that they were shipping. So there was always an emphasis on freight traffic in these early communities. And board and batten depots were very quick and easy to build. They were very inexpensive, and they could be shipped as kind of like kits to the different locations. So all the doors, windows, parts would be loaded onto a boxcar along with all the necessary lumber, shingles, bricks, things like that to a particular site. And then the railroad workers would normally put the building up in maybe like about a month's time or so, depending on how complex the structure was. Here's a blueprint that I drew of the San Fernando Depot. Kind of shows you a typical drawing that I do when I study these train stations. And these stations had a very basic function and a very basic layout. They would have a waiting room for passengers, an office for the railroad agent, baggage room sometimes, and then usually a large freight house to accommodate the agricultural products that were coming out. Like I said, initially when the Southern Pacific was designing their depots, they were pretty much standard 32-foot wide by variable distances in length. If a community was going to be, they anticipated not a lot of freight traffic, they would build a smaller freight house on the end of the depot. If it was going to be if they anticipated a lot of agricultural products coming through, they would extend the freight house and make it larger. When we get into the 1880s, the Southern Pacific started designing a series of standardized depot types that they started installing in their different communities that they served. This particular depot type found in Tropico, and for people today, that's Glendale, California. This was a number 7 depot. Again, you can see the kind of like standard depot layout with the waiting room to the left, the office in the middle with the bay window, and then you can see the freight house off to the right. And then another common feature of these depots, and not to be missed, is off to the left-hand side of the gentleman standing there, you will see a 2-hole outhouse, which was actually a common standard. Depots at this time did not have interior plumbing. They were still using, outhouses, just like the general public was, and they tried to locate them away from the depots, for natural reasons. But this is a very typical scene of depots in the 1880s that the Southern Pacific was building. Here's the depot a little bit later, around 1912. And then here's my blueprint that I drew of the Glendale Tropico Depot. Again, waiting room, office, baggage room, and freight house. This was a 1-story depot. A little smaller variant of this was the number 11 type of depot. Very small indeed, because it had just very limited doors and windows. Because of the depots of the San Fernando Valley's closeness to Hollywood and early movie making studios, they often appeared in a lot of films. So as a researcher, it's fascinating to find these depots popping up in old silent movies or movies you might see on Turner Network or things like that. Depots pop up everywhere in old movies and sometimes TV shows. And this was a filming of a Western at the Burbank Depot in the 1920s. And typically, when a studio would get in, they would actually put in whatever station name they wanted to over the actual station name of the depot. In this instance, though, they left it as Burbank. Here's the Burbank Depot a little bit later in its life in 1925. And unfortunately, a lot of these depots are no longer with us today. So if you wanted to visit a number 11 depot, there is still one surviving in Southern California. If you journey up to Fillmore, California, you can actually visit this restored number 11 depot that's there and serves the Fillmore and Western tourist railway. Here's a blueprint that I drew of the Burbank train station. Again, a very small footprint for the building, a minimal amount of doors and windows. This was Southern Pacific's lowest cost standard depot. Here is a look at the San Fernando Depot's early board and batten replacement. This was a number 16 depot. In all, the Southern Pacific produced 26 standard designs for their train stations. And depending on the location of the community, it would warrant different designs to be built there. This was probably one of their longer styles of depots. It's a little hard to see it in the photograph, but there's 3 freight doors on this building, which means it's a rather large freight house, showing the importance of San Fernando for shipping agricultural goods. Here's a view of it from the 1940s. And it was unfortunately a victim of fire in 1961, and it was bulldozed not too long after that. Here's my blueprint of the San Fernando Depot. And you can see that really long freight house off to the left there. I'm sorry, off to the right. Now, we've been looking at the one-story depots. The two-story train stations have an interesting story behind them. Oftentimes, a lot of these depots, the agent lived locally in town. He would go to the depot during the business hours, open up the depot, conduct his business, and then he would close up the building. For some agencies, the railroad felt it was important to have an agent stationed in the depot 24 hours a day. So it was a living situation for them. And the second floor provided living quarters for the agent and his family. Here you see the two-story number 17 depot in Santa Paula, California. This is the, believe the arrival, they're waiting for a president to come into town. And then this is what the restored Santa Paula Depot looks like today. It's an interesting fact that most Southern Pacific depots they're known to be yellow walls with brown trim and white windows and doors. The agent in Santa Paula in the 1950s actually petitioned the railroad and his bosses if he could repaint the depot in red and white to honor the local Cardinals high school football team, because his son was there in the Santa Paula High School. And the railroad actually obliged his request, and the depot has been red and white ever since. So it's kind of a unique color scheme for a Southern Pacific depot. Here's actually what the Santa Paula Depot would have looked like in its yellow and brown paint scheme. This is actually a laser kit that was produced based on my drawings. And this is HO scale for a lot of the model railroaders watching. It was a very popular depot type. There were lots of these depots built by the railroad throughout California. And here's my blueprint that model was based on. Again, you can see that it's a pretty basic layout with the waiting room, the office, the baggage room, little storage room, and then of course the large freight house. But when you get up to the second floor, you have the 2 bedrooms, you have the kitchen and a dining room. And after the turn of the century, starting around 1910 or so, a lot of the agents asked if they could install plumbing into these depots. So a lot of times they would actually get a little bath addition up in the attic space above the baggage room and sometimes the freight house. And that's that little extra room you see off to the part of the second floor. They also at this time started adding restrooms for the passengers, and they would carve out a little space out of the freight house, and they would add facilities for both men and women for the passengers. Another great 2-story depot type was the number 18 style. This was built in Chatsworth Park in 1893. There's the depot in the center of the photograph. And here's a close-up of it. You can see it's a rather attractive depot. This depot lasted until about 1908. The railroad was putting a bypass through the Chatsworth Mountains. And so this depot was bypassed, but it also caught fire and burned down. So it was replaced by the railroad. Some interesting images in this, or some of the interesting railroad, the semaphore. You can see that's an early style of semaphore, and then an early station sign that's square. Unfortunately, again, like I said, that depot was torn down after it burned. But if you want to visit a number 18 depot that still survives in Southern California, in fact, the only one, make a short journey over to Whittier, California, and they have restored their number 18 depot as the transportation center offices for the city of Whittier. So the upstairs actually is remarkably well preserved. They just simply converted all the bedrooms and kitchen and everything into offices, but they left all the wood trim and everything there. And there's a little small transportation exhibit down in the first floor. In the freight house, they turned that actually into a community meeting space. So it's a great example of an adaptive reuse of an old historic building for modern purposes, but being able to reuse it and keep it. Beautiful job on the restoration. Here's my blueprint of the number 18 depot. Again, the second story provided living quarters for the agent and his family. Another interesting depot that survives today is the one that's in Lancashire, or most folks know it as North Hollywood today. Here's an end view of that one-story depot. This was an interesting example where it was actually served by both the Southern Pacific Railroad and the Pacific Electric, subsidiary of the Southern Pacific. The Whittier Depot actually had that distinction as well. It served both railroads. Here's a great color photo showing towards the end of Pacific Electric service, parked in front of the North Hollywood Depot at this time. After it left railroad service, it became privately used. And just recently, in 2017, it was restored. So if you're craving a cup of joe, it's actually a coffee house today. So if you're in the neighborhood of North Hollywood, it's a wonderful depot to go see. They kept the exterior, they restored the entire exterior of the building, and they did a wonderful job on the retaining a lot of the historic elements from the interior. Here's my blueprint of the original Lancashire Depot in North Hollywood. And then what you see here also, sometimes depending on how much agricultural products a particular depot was being used for, they would add on an open freight shed to the end of the depot, as you can see here. You can see these wood posts supporting the end of that open shed. And that could house anything from products from like citrus to wine to walnuts, depending on the agriculture of the area. A depot that was built in large amounts was the number 22 style of depot. They were very popular. There was over 90 of them built throughout California, Nevada, and other states that the Southern Pacific visited. Here's the one that was built in Chatsworth, California. Again, here's a depot appearing in the background of a film, again in the 1920s. And here's the depot in its beautiful yellow and brown color scheme in the 1950s. I always love seeing early color photographs of these depots because most of the time when you see these depots, you only see them in black and white. So you really don't get that full appreciation of the color of these depots. And a lot of the architectural styling as well. I love the gable vent up there. Here's my blueprint of the Chatsworth Depot. And as you can see in my blueprints, I love to include a lot of architectural details that are unique to that particular depot, whether it's the attic vents or the finials, the ridge cresting, the shingle patterns, and things like that. Again, this is a two-story building or a two-story depot, so you find living quarters for the agent. Here's the depot that was built at Zelza, and of course, a lot of people don't know what that town is. So it was renamed to North Los Angeles. Again, went through another name change, and it later became Northridge in 1950. This is, again, a number 22 style depot. Sadly, again, this depot is no longer with us. But if you want to visit a surviving number 22 depot in Southern California, if you go to the community of Santa Susana, their depot has been relocated and preserved, and it's actually adjacent to the railroad tracks. So it's kind of a nice place to go train watching. It's a beautiful museum. The freight house has a large HO scale model layout. The waiting room and the office have been restored, so you can actually see a lot of antique railroad equipment and see what an actual waiting room would look like back in the early 1900s. And then the upstairs agent's quarter was recently remodeled back into an agent's apartment. So into a historical display. So they've brought in historic furniture, they've restored the historic rooms, the kitchen, and things like that. So you actually can get a sense of how these agents lived back when these depots were being built in the late 1890s up until about the 1910s or so. This was Southern Pacific's most common design, and it was also its longest built of depots. Here's my blueprint of the Northridge, North Los Angeles, and Zelza Depot as it changed names over time. Some unique style depots. The Southern Pacific, again, they had these 26 standard designs, but they also were known for designing a lot of one-off buildings, or sometimes they would design maybe 1, 2, or 3 of a particular type of building, and they would reuse the plans. This is the Southern Pacific Depot in Owens Mouth. It has a glazed white brick. It was a very beautiful building. Here it is after it left service in the railroad and became a private residence in the 1930s. And then sadly, again, this depot, it survived until the modern era, but suffered a fire and was subsequently torn down. It was actually turned into a car dealership of all things, but kind of a sad ending to a really beautiful building. Here's my blueprint of the beautiful Owens Mouth Depot. Freight houses were another common feature that you would see along the railroad tracks in different communities. Sometimes you'd have a separate passenger depot, separate from your freight house, such as the case was in Owens Mouth. The depot you previously saw was a passenger-only station, so it had large baggage room and facilities for the passengers. But they had an adjacent freight house, and that serviced the freight traffic. So here it is a few years later in the 1920s. And it survived up until June of 1990 and then was torn down. Here's a blueprint of that Owens Mouth, and then later renamed Canoga Park Depot. A similar depot was built in the community of Van Nuys. Here it is being under construction in 1914. And here it is during the Great Flood a few months later. You can see the beautiful brickwork that was used for the construction of this building, and the really beautiful Spanish tile. Here's another view of that 1914 flood. Photos of the backside of depots are actually very rare. The front sides of depots were photographed the most because that's where all the action was. That's where the trains were, the passengers were, and things like that. So as a historian, photographs that show the back of depots are like gems of gold for us, because they're rare photographs. You don't see a lot of them. Even rarer still are interior photographs of depots, especially ones that were taken during railroad service, because a lot of people took photographs outside. They didn't take a lot of interior photos of these buildings. Here's my blueprint of the Van Nuys Depot. Again, they would have freight houses that would serve in addition to their passenger depots. The freight house in Van Nuys was very unique in that it was actually built out of a concrete block. It's the only type that I've seen where the Southern Pacific built a depot like this, especially for a freight house. But by the time that this was being built, it was probably a little bit more inexpensive for the railroad. So they went with the block design. Sadly, again, this depot did not survive. It was torn down. And then here's a drawing of that depot that I drew. I think one of the most beautiful depots in the San Fernando Valley, hands down, has to be the Glendale train station. This was built in 1924. Here it is here with the platform. It's designed in a Spanish churrigueresque style. Here you see the entry element, and that's all cast stone or cast concrete. So all that, the columns, the surface reveals, that's all cast concrete, but it's made to look like stone. It's very beautiful, and you'll see a lot of wrought iron work on the little balconette up there, which is not actually functioning, but decorative. And you'll see wrought iron railings at the windows. Here's a close-up detail of the door. And you can see that cast concrete work that's been painted. And if you look above the Southern Pacific Line's logo, which has been restored, you'll see the profile of a small steam train in between two figures of mermen on either side. It's kind of like a little bit of a nautical theme with the porthole doors. And here's a restored view of the depot today. Very much an active train station. Here's my blueprint that I drew of the Glendale Depot. A lot of details in this building. It's a all cast concrete building. This was something that the Southern Pacific was starting to do in the 1920s, where they were replacing their older wooden depots with newer modern ones. And sometimes they would use masonry, sometimes they would use brick or concrete. So this was an all cast concrete depot, which attests to its survival today. Another really beautiful depot was in Burbank, California. This one had a relatively long service life. But again, unfortunately, after it was transferred to the city of Burbank, it burned down in 1991 and was demolished. And so because this depot was not around to measure, I relied on the resources of the Glendale Historical Society and actual members of the railroad community who had taken lots of photographs of this depot over the years and actually had drawn notes about it. And using all of those combined resources, I was actually able to recreate the building in this blueprint form. And so it was hours of studying historic photos and maps and notes from people that loved this building and lamented its loss. Some other additional unique railroad buildings that the railroad would build. This is the Soldiers Home Depot. It was on the grounds of the National Home for Disabled Veteran Soldiers. And that's a rather long name to say, but if you want to go visit it today, just simply go to the VA grounds or the Veterans Administration grounds right off of Wilshire Boulevard at the 405 freeway. This depot was built to serve the veteran soldiers, and it went through a couple of reiterations. It was originally built by the Southern Pacific Railroad, was taken over by the Los Angeles Pacific Company, and was used as a trolley station for them for several years after it was relocated on the grounds. I wrote a rather extensive history article about the history of this building. A lot of people mistakenly think it's built by the Los Angeles Pacific, but I was able to prove it was actually a standard Southern Pacific depot. And there were several of these types of small buildings built throughout California by the Southern Pacific Railroad. So I basically rewrote the history of this building through my research. And in 2014, I entered this drawing into the Leicester B Holland Prize competition, and I was the runner-up for the national competition. So this is the blueprint that I took second place in that nationwide competition. And it shows the original location of the depot and how it originally was configured and how it was modified over time. And again, I love the architectural detailing in this building. So I included a lot of those details in my blueprint. Another fascinating depot on the edge of the San Fernando Valley is the Palms Depot. This was a beautiful, or is a beautiful, two-story depot. Again, agents' quarters up above. And it has been restored today. It's along the 110 freeway, the Arroyo Seco Parkway, in Heritage Square in Los Angeles. And here's the depot after they had just put on a new wood shingle roof. So this kind of gives you an idea of how these depots were finished off as far as the wood shingling goes. Beautifully restored, historically accurate paint colors. It's a real gem of a depot to visit. So if you're ever in the Heritage Square area, you can enjoy this and 5 other Victorian residences that have been, and businesses that have been restored in that park. So it's a beautiful depot. I love going there. Here's my blueprint of the Palms Depot. And then I don't always draw just depots. I also love studying other historic buildings. A rather unique structure in Southern California is the Octagon House in Pasadena that was built in 1896. And it was moved to Heritage Square back in the 1980s. And so here it is restored today. It's a beautiful building. It sometimes ends up in a lot of movies today as a Victorian home. They use it for a lot of filming, but it's a fantastic building. It's fully restored on the outside, but they have not restored the inside. And here's my blueprint of the Octagon House, the only surviving Octagon House in Southern California. So you don't have to travel anywhere else to see this unique style of architecture. But it originally came from Pasadena. It was originally moved from there. We're starting to wind up our look at the San Fernando Valley. This was the Sagas Depot. This was a two-story depot that was actually used as a restaurant and boarding house. The one-story portion off to the left, you can see is the dining room area and the kitchen. And then off to the right was the baggage room / freight at that time. And then the upstairs actually was rooms for boarding initially, but then they later became living quarters for the agent and his family. Here's another early view of the depot. This is my first blueprint of the Sagas Depot because it shows it as a restaurant. So it shows the dining room, the kitchen layout, and the configuration of the building. Later, after 1910, when the restaurant moved out, the depot was reconfigured. Here it is being moved in 1980 to preserve it. And here it is today. It's now home to the Santa Clarita Valley Historical Society. And again, another great museum that's worthy of a visit. And this is my blueprint of the depot after it was remodeled in 1910. So the restaurant area and the dining room became the freight house of this particular depot. And the waiting rooms were reconfigured. All right, now we're coming to the additional part of my lecture. Like I said, when I was getting ready to get my lecture together for the Glendora Historical Society, I have a great friend, Susan, who is hopefully watching. She's a good family friend and my like sister-in-law. And I was inspired to do the depots of Glendora to add to the lecture. Now, I love collecting depots, and so I couldn't just stop with Glendora. So I ended up putting together quite a few depots that I came across during my research. So this is what I call a selection of some of the unique depots that were built by various railroads at different times in this area. So it's a combination of the depots that eventually became folded into the Santa Fe Railroad. There's a lot of predecessor railroads and a lot of railroad history that went into those. The Southern Pacific Railroad built a lot of depots in this area. Of course, in the early 1900s, the Pacific Electric came in and started serving this area. You did have some of the depots of the Salt Lake route being built and the Union Pacific. This area alone probably has the greatest diversity of depots I've ever come across. Some communities would have 4 different depots because of the different rail services that they provided. So this is an overall look at the one side of the valley, going from Pasadena to Claremont and all the cities in between. And then as we go across, we're going to go from Upland to San Bernardino. We're not going to hit every town. There's a lot of depots that were built, but I selected some of my favorites that I thought I would share with you this evening. It's interesting because this area also has a lot of, because it has a lot of these depots or some of them that have survived, and some of them are being reused by more modern transportation systems. One of the ones that's a big one is the Metrolink, and you can see their routes on the map today and some of the stations that they visit. And then so they're using a lot of the old railroad right-of-ways of these predecessor railroad companies. And then Metro has been expanding on some of the old Pacific Electric right-of-ways and restoring, service to some of these rail service to some of these communities as well. So what did some of these standard depots comprised of? Well, as you saw from earlier in my lecture, the basic layout of the depots is pretty much the same for any railroad company. Here's a number 22 depot type built by the Southern Pacific, again in great amounts from around 1895 to about 1910. I've seen examples as late as 1914, but would usually have a waiting room, an office, the baggage room, and a freight room, and then it would have the records room and restrooms for the passengers. And then the second floor, of course, would be the agent's living quarters. Let's take a look at the Pacific Electric depots. Now, these ones, as far as I know, there were no two-story examples, unless they were some kind of like a division headquarters or offices or something like that. But almost all the depots for the Pacific Electric were one-story. And again, they consisted of the basic open waiting rooms, agent's office, sometimes a baggage room and a freight room. And then they would have restrooms for the passengers and for the agent. And the same thing for the Santa Fe. Here's a typical Santa Fe small station with a waiting room, baggage room, agent's office, and freight house. So you can see that the layouts of these particular depots shared a common purpose. So if you were an agent going from one depot to another, you would feel right at home and you would know where everything was located in these buildings. One of the first communities we're going to look at tonight is Glendora. Oh, wait a minute. That doesn't say Glendora. That says Alosta. That was the original name of Glendora back in 1888. And so there's the depot. We see it in the top of the map. Let's take a little bit of closer look at that depot right there. Beautiful Victorian depot built by a predecessor to the Santa Fe. And here is the Glendora Depot in the 1940s. This depot was removed in 1946 and a more streamlined modern depot was built in its place. And so there's a great action shot. Sadly, this depot does not survive today. One of the other depots, like I said, some communities had, several of them depending on how many rail lines served them. This is the Pacific Electric Depot that was built in Glendora in 1907. So here's an early construction view. You can still see they haven't backfilled all the dirt around the depot yet. Here it is in around 1913, the pepper trees and things are starting to grow around the depot. And here it is in 1937. In the nearby community of San Dimas, this was the Santa Fe Depot that was built in the 1890s. These were originally built by the Southern California Railway, which folded into the Santa Fe. So for the simplicity of this lecture, I just refer to them as the Santa Fe Depot. Here's the depot a few years later. And this was its replacement in 1934, a beautiful streamlined modern depot. You can kind of see a theme that I touched on in the San Fernando Valley portion of my lecture, where a lot of these older wooden depots passed out of favor with the public and, they became aged. So the railroads embarked on a program of replacing their earlier wooden depots with a lot of these more modern depots, hoping to, keep up with the times. The Victorian architecture was seen as dated and passé. Here's a look at the streamlined modern depot today. It was now the Pacific Railroad Historical Society. And beautiful museum. It's well worth a visit in San Dimas. Beautiful exhibits, and it's a wonderful little depot. Here was the Pacific Electric Depot that served San Dimas. And here it is, another shot of it. You can see the vines starting to grow up on the building. San Dimas also had a Southern Pacific Depot. This was a two-story depot. And at some point, the two-story depot was reduced to one story. I haven't figured out the exact year that that occurred, but an interesting side note is that for every two-story depot version the Southern Pacific had, it had an equivalent one-story. So maybe in this instance, the railroad no longer needed an agent all the time in San Dimas at the depot. So they simply remodeled the depot into a one-story building. This depot unfortunately did not survive. Here it is in the 1940s. It burned in a wildfire in September of 1955 and was subsequently lost. But again, here's another wonderful example of the Southern Pacific and the Pacific Electric sharing a depot for use. Another town that had multiple depots was the community of Pomona. There was an earlier depot that was built, but this was the community's second depot built by the Southern Pacific Railroad. This is a number 13/19 style depot, or a county seat depot, a rather large depot. Here's the beautiful gardens outside of the depot. A lot of these depots were showplaces for the community, for the railroad to landscape and show how beautiful their railroad service was. So they would often at these depot grounds have these lush gardens. Here's the Pomona Depot after it was stuccoed and remodeled. Again, an example where the railroad was trying to update their older wooden depots into a more modern structure, so it doesn't look as Victorian. But then again, in the starting in the 1940s, they went over and they remodeled this particular depot, and as part of a modernization program. So here it is in the 1940s. This depot survives today, so you can go and take a look at it. The Salt Lake Company, Salt Lake and San Pedro came in, and they built their railroad line also through Pomona. So this is their depot. It is in a few years. And then it was remodeled sometime in the 40s. And here you can actually see it in the service of the Union Pacific. That's the Union Pacific Herald that you can see just under the Pomona sign. And then later on, even that depot was replaced with a more modern structure. This is the Union Pacific Depot that replaced it. And it is actually just across the street from the Southern Pacific Depot. You can see the Southern Pacific Depot off to the left. Then this is the Santa Fe Depot that was actually built in North Pomona, but they ended up calling it Pomona. And so there's that depot. This is the Pacific Electric Depot that was built in Pomona. It was later replaced by a more modern station that combined both the Pacific Electric, the Greyhound, and the Union Pacific stage lines for modern bus service. Now we're going to visit the town of Lordsburg, but again, a lot of folks don't know it by that name. It's now Laverne. So here it is after its name change. Again, this started off as a Southern Pacific depot, but then eventually got service also from the Pacific Electric. So here you can see a steam train going by, but you can see the overhead electric lines in the right-hand edge of the upper part of the photograph. And here you can see the station sign clearly delineating it as a Pacific Electric freight station in later years. Beautiful Santa Fe Depot in the town of Duarte. Duarte also had a Southern Pacific Depot, two-story number 22. Here's the back side of it. Azusa, another wonderful community with a Santa Fe Depot. And what I thought was interesting is when I was doing my research for this lecture, I'm going to go back. So this Victorian era depot was actually remodeled in 1946 into this streamlined modern depot. So it actually makes this depot one of the older surviving depots in the San Gabriel area. Even though it's been extensively remodeled, it's still, it's the bones of it are still an old depot. So that's the Azusa station. Here it is a few years later. And this is what it looks like today as the metro line runs right next to it. Also in Azusa, they had a Pacific Electric station. Arcadia, another great town that had a lot of railroad heritage. Here is the Southern Pacific Depot that's there. And that depot actually survives today. It was relocated to Traveltown in Los Angeles. So if you want to grab the grandkids and ride on a little miniature train, go to Traveltown and you can visit the Arcadia Southern Pacific Freight Depot. It's still there today. I love this depot and I'm so glad that it survived. This is the old Santa Fe Depot of Arcadia. Here it is a few years after it was moved across the street from where its old location. And then it moved yet again to the Pomona Fairplex, where you can go visit it today. Another beautiful Santa Fe depot that's with us is the Santa Anita Depot. Here it is just after its construction in 1890. You know, maybe that's the agent and his family up there in the balcony, you know, waving on the incoming train. Here's the depot in the 1940s.
Station wasn't there.
And then in 1968, in the building of the 210 freeway, it necessitated moving the depot. So they disassembled it brick by brick, salvaged all the wood parts like the balcony, doors, windows, trims, things like that. And they reconstructed it at the Los Angeles County Arboretum. And here it is under reconstruction in 1969. And this is how it appears today. So it's a beautiful restored depot. It's got all, you know, nice original furnishings and historical displays in it. It's well worth the visit to the Arboretum. If not only just to visit the beautiful like Lucky Baldwin estate and home or the gardens there, you know, the depot's a real gem. In Monrovia, here's the Pacific Electric Depot. You can see it changing a couple times over the years, those pepper trees growing. Monrovia also had a Santa Fe Depot. And that was eventually replaced by a more Spanish Moorish style building depot. And we're very lucky that this depot survives today, although it did go through some rough times. It did go through underneath a full restoration. And here's what that completed depot looks like today. Now this is the street side of the depot or the back side of the depot. This is the track side, which unfortunately is very hard to get to. To get a really clear shot, you have to go to there's a car wash across the tracks from it. And that's really the only clear vantage point where you can see the track side of this particular building. But it's got a beautiful cast sandstone entry facade. Claremont, Santa Fe Depot again. It was subsequently replaced again in the 1920s by a beautiful Spanish Moorish style depot. And here it is a few years later, undergoing restoration. And here it is today in 2020. Again, a beautiful depot. It's really nicely done. And it has the benefit of being placed on the National Register of Historic Places. So it's a nice little preserved treasure to go and visit. Here's the Pacific Electric Southern Pacific Depot in Claremont. Sadly, again, this one is not with us today. Etiwanda, it had a little small Santa Fe Depot and a cute little Pacific Electric Depot.
Still there.
And the depot is still there. Here I am visiting it back in 2017, awaiting a full restoration and reuse, adaptive reuse. We're coming up to the end of our look at the San Gabriel Valley and its adjacent communities. Kind of starting to finish off with the San Bernardino Depot. This one was shared by both the Southern Pacific and the Salt Lake Railroad. So it was jointly used by both railroads. And this one went through a couple of changes. Here it is after the Salt Lake moved out, the Pacific Electric moved in. And so the two railroads used the depot at that time. This is the back side of the depot, and you can see the tracks coming in. You can see the overhead electric lines off to the left upper hand side of the photo. And then eventually this was used by Greyhound lines. Sadly, this depot and all of the buildings on the block and across the street from it in San Bernardino were torn down. And the Carousel Mall occupies the site today, for those that are familiar with the area. The old San Bernardino Santa Fe Depot was a magnificent two-story Depot Hotel Restaurant, Grand Victorian Affair in Eastlake details. Here's the track side of the building. And here's the bustling railroad yard. The depot served both the Santa Fe and also the Pacific Electric. Pacific Electric, of course, came to the front of the depot. Sadly, this depot burned in 1916, tragically, but it was replaced by a more magnificent structure. Here's a beautiful Mission Revival style building that we can all appreciate today as the San Bernardino Railroad Museum. And Harvey House is, the historic Harvey House was in there, and offices for the Santa Fe Railroad. And it's served by Metrolink today. And again, we're lucky that this one is added to the National Register of Historic Places. So I'm going to end my presentation this evening with a tale of a small little brick depot built at Patton, California. Some of you may know the history of the Patton State Railroad, or the Patton State Hospital that was built near Highland, California, just a little bit north of San Bernardino. So this little brick depot was designed by the Santa Fe Railroad in 1898. And it was a very, very charming depot. You can see that it's kind of Moorish in style. It had a little brick parapet going around it, beautiful brick arches. I mean, this is a gem of a depot. Here it is in the 1920s. Again, just a real small, unique train station. And in a few years later, in 1965, they added this like kind of concrete platform at the front, and then added a kind of metal warehouse. For many years, it was used as a farmer's market. Eventually, it was acquired by the San Manuel Mission Band of Indians, and it became part of their property. And this is what the depot looked like up until December of this past year in 2020, because on December 15th, 2020, the depot was demolished without any kind of notice or any kind of advance warning, which caught a lot of us in the preservation community off guard. It's really a sad, tragic loss for such a unique what would have been a surviving depot, especially for it to have been here since 1898. Unfortunately, this building never seems to have been registered as a landmark or nominated. We're still doing research onto why this event occurred, and we hope that by doing our research, we'll be able to prevent something like, a tragic story like this repeating itself again. But sadly, if you wanted to go visit this depot, you would not find it. It's no longer there. So with that, though, I do want to end on a more happier note. For those that are interested in finding out more information about these beautiful depots and the unique railroad heritage of this area, I invite you to take a look at some of these great books that talk about the Southern Pacific depots, the Pacific Electric depots, the Santa Fe depots, and then ones that delve into the history of them with the Los Angeles Division and the San Fernando Valley. Feel free to contact me at the end of the lecture, and I'd be happy to provide you with a bibliography of these resources. So with that, I want to thank you for joining me on this tour of the depots of the San Fernando Valley and adjacent San Gabriel Valley and adjoining communities. And I invite you to ask questions. So I'm assuming the moderators.
Yeah, I was just looking at the questions. Ruby had a question. Do you have a drawing of the La Grande station?
The La Grande Depot? That's Santa Fe, right? Correct?
Yes.
Yes.
I do not, but I can look through records and see if there are. The Santa Fe Modeling Society is a very active historical group, and it would be well worth contacting them and see if they have the blueprints for it. Another great resource for depot photographs and blueprints is the, believe it or not, the Kansas Memory Project. It's an online archive for the state of Kansas, but it has a large, very large collection of Santa Fe historical drawings and photographs of their depots. So I would try those two resources. My expertise is mostly Southern Pacific depots. So I did consult those resources for some of the material for this lecture. Next question.
Someone said that they would like to see the blueprints of Swan Rotunda. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Swan, TSWUN? No?
I can't say that. That sounds familiar.
Okay.
Sorry about that, folks.
And then someone wanted to know the location of Tropica.
Oh, Tropico, the old Tropico.
Tropico, yeah.
Yeah, so that was near the modern Glendale Depot. It was very close to there.
Okay. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand.
There's a share screen. Which is lovely.
Everyone's commenting how great your presentation was, by the way.
Oh, thank you very much. I love that. It's a nice silent way of saying, thank you.
Jean, is it possible to have your email address?
Oh, yes, of
If
course.
other people have questions to send them to you?
Yes, of course. I probably should have typed it on the screen, but it's for those that want to send me questions, it's J, G, and then Dubé, DUBE at hotmail.com. So it's the first two initials of my first name and my last name. So J, G, Dubé, DUBE at hotmail.com.
Great. Thank
And
you.
I went
Happy
ahead
to try and answer questions.
Chat too. There is one more question.
Oh, sure.
How many hours does it take for you? Does it take for one of your drawings? They are beautiful. And that's from
Oh,
Danielle.
thank you. Yeah, that's a wonderful question. It typically takes me about 2 to 3 months to do each drawing. And then keep in mind that I'm doing multiple depots simultaneously. So I'm not just working on one at any one time. But I would estimate that it would probably in the neighborhood of about 120 hours for each drawing, because from that I actually draw the floor plan, I model all the elements and things like that, and then I can actually use those to print my depots not only as blueprints, but I actually now have the capability of printing them in 3D. So it's an exciting new adventure for me to take my work into that venue of being able to physically print these depots in 3D. So it's kind of fun. And most of you here are hearing that for the very first time. I actually purchased a 3D printer that I'm very anxious to hook up and start printing and printing my models.
Anita wants to know about your book and where to get it.
Oh, yes, of course. So as you look on the screen there, that's where my book is located. It's on my Etsy store. So www.etsy.com/shop/Depot Blueprints. And if you order my book, I'm more than happy to sign it for you. If you're also on my website, you'll also find some of my blueprints that I've done. That was my main thing. I used to print them as Diazo prints and stuff. Yeah, and I will tell you that my book is very close to selling out. I only have about, I think I have 15 copies left. So they're getting extremely hard to find. I did initially have some on other like stores and locations, but I only have the copies that are left now on my Etsy store. So those are the last copies. And what I'm doing is I'm focusing my energy on a volume 2 of my book. So it's going to be all new depots, different types. It's going to have some Pacific Electric, some Union Pacific, still mostly Southern Pacific, and then of course some unique building types as well. So, and I'm working towards a publication date. Don't quote me on this, but September of 2021.
And then Bob just commented that in one of the black and white photos that you showed, it looked like the people outside might have been wearing masks. No?
Oh, I have to go back through my lecture and take a look at that. Does he, which one was he thinking? That was kind of interesting. Maybe it was the steam engine going by and they just were getting smoked out or something.
And that's all the questions I have in the chat.
Oh, okay. Well, again, I just want to thank you for hosting me in this lecture. I had a lot of fun putting it together.